Hi, I'm Victoria Kingston. I'm Simon's wife and co-organiser of this festival. And it's the first time I've got the mic, so...
Yay! Yay!
Thank you all for coming to the second panel on commemoration of the First World War. We had an excellent session on participation. Tomorrow is actually the centenary of the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele, in which many Irishmen fought and died. So in some ways this is our commemoration of that event. I will probably hand you over at this stage to Simon King, Dr. Simon King at the end of the table, who's going to chair the panel. He is a political scientist who studied at Trinity and has a doctorate at Oxford, but he's also frequently confused with my husband, Simon Kingston. So they've known each other a long time and people always get them muddled up. But this is Simon King, and he's going to run this panel for us. So thank you very much.
I hope you don't. Thanks very much, Victoria. So, just to make the introductions, at the end there we have Professor Nigel Biggar, who's a professor of Christian theology at Christ Church at Oxford. He's a sophist, really, in my eyes. A great great thinker on ethical matters. Widely published. Probably his most influential book for me is a book called Burying the Past, which he published in 2001, and that talks about how newly democratic nations put the rest the conflicts of the past, and so commemoration will feature in that. Kevin Myers doesn't need much of an introduction, everyone knows who he is, but I should say here, for the purpose of this discussion, I would remind everyone how doggedly determined Kevin has been over the last 30 years in writing about commemorating World War I. And really, I mean, he's really been the sort of public consciousness of that in many, many ways, through the Irish Times and other publications. Thank you. We have Lady Neuberger, Rabbi Julie Neuberger, who's a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, also a writer and thinker, and we'll have some very interesting things to say. And then Ruth Dudley Edwards, dazzling journalist, historian, marvelous writer of fiction and non-fiction. Her latest work is on the men who built the Republic. And so what I think we'll do on in this particular panel, we'll have it similar to the last one. We'll start maybe with a few of the specifics, and if maybe Kevin and Ruth could talk a little bit about how we kind of got to where we are with commemorating Ireland in the First World War, and some of the battles that had to be fought and where we are with that. You know, talking about sort of commemorating things in Ireland generally, we tend to commemorate battles. We're quite good at commemorating stuff in Ireland, kind of mostly because there's a commercial incentive to do so. Roy Foster talked about the sort of the commemoration of the kind of big things in his lecture on Friday. You know, the 1916, 1798. But I'm kind of interested in the stuff that we don't commemorate, or when the enthusiasm to commemorate stuff kind of runs out, or just isn't there. So, why don't we commemorate the Battle of Clontarf? Do we commemorate that very much? 1014, maybe a little bit. Spanish Armada of 1588. I recall a little bit of that. You don't recall much talk these days about Hugh O'Neill's defeat of the English in 1358. 9 Years' War in the early 1600s really affected Ireland. 1641 Irish Rebellion. Do we talk about that much? It's always Dan Mulhall mentioned the 1848 rebellion in his thing. I've always been intrigued by the 1848 rebellion, which is really more of a rally in my eyes. Bearing in mind that it lasts precisely 7 hours, takes place exclusively in Mrs. McCormick's cabbage patch, and ends up with William Smith O'Brien shaking hands with a policeman through a window. But of course it led to the deportation of John Mitchell and the Fenians running off to Europe and all that kind of thing. And then we might talk a little bit about commemoration in general and what we shouldn't commemorate, and maybe some of the problems with commemoration more widely, and what commemoration per se should achieve. So maybe we could start with Kevin then on the First World War in Ireland in particular.
The First World War, by the time I started writing about it a very long time ago, had ceased to exist at any level in the popular imagination of the Irish people in the Republic. In Northern Ireland, it had been requisitioned entirely by the Unionist population, who had a monopoly of all public ceremonial and ownership of all the statues, which are actually quite impartial and ecumenical in their recognition of the people of both traditions, and none whatever. And we must remember, an awful lot of people in Ireland do not have, then and now, are not driven by national identity. They're driven by their own particular ambitions. They don't define themselves by their larger identity, but they drive by themselves. But the neglect of the Irish dead and the Irish living of the Great War was emblemised most of all by the condition of Island Bridge Park, which, when I was first there in 1979, had been turned into a corporation tiphead. I mean, tens of thousands of tons of rubbish had been dumped there. The great lithic candles of stone had been felled. The walls which circumscribed the park were covered in graffiti. It had become a travellers' halting site. It was a place druggies would gather. It was a slum. And it was a place where Dublin Corporation chose, not quite metaphorically, but quite literally, to empty the excrement of the city of Dublin. This kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. And what happened in 1970 was the Office of Public Works, which had the public responsibility for minding the park, had withdrawn their gardeners. They didn't actually have a policy of neglecting the park as a policy of not doing anything. And when you withdraw gardeners from any park, within no time at all, it's no longer a park but a wilderness. And over the following 9 years, it turned into a wilderness, which was then requisitioned by Dublin Corporation as a corporation dump. And that paralleled the extinction of all public memory within nationalist Ireland of the nationalist contribution to the First World War, which wasn't the case in the 1920s and 1930s. Every Remembrance Sunday in Dublin, tens of thousands of people would gather outside Trinity and would walk up Dame Street to the Phoenix Park. When De Valera came into power, he was clearly unhappy about this, and the IRA at that point began attacking the marchers, and De Valera decided to take legal action to prevent the march taking place. And that was a process of reinventing the Irish imagination. That he did so successfully is a testament to his own skills and to the appetite, an entirely understandable appetite, to create a new political narrative around which Irish public life could be created. Now, De Valera was responsible for completion of the Island Bridge Park, which had begun under the previous administration, but he refused to open it officially. And indeed, it was never officially opened until the 1980s, after two men whom I took around the park, Sir John Gorman and Campbell Heather. Sir John Gorman was an Irish guardsman in the Second World War, and later an RUC man, a Catholic RUC officer, whose family originally came from Kilkenny, and Campbell Heather was also Irish Guards pedigree. They were appalled, and they began the campaign. I can't claim credit for the campaign that followed, that led to the restoration of the park, but I can claim credit for drawing the condition of the park, to other people's attention. And in the recreation of an awareness, an astonishing act of generosity by all sides. I mean, I have to identify Fianna Fáil as a primary energizer in this, and Bertie Ahern in particular. The primary ingredient wasn't anything I did or said or wrote. Most of what I did and said and wrote was ignored. The primary energizer was the provisional IRA with the bombing at Enniskillen. And I know from people's responses then that a profound sense of shock and shame passed through nationalist Ireland. And this is true of nationalists in the north. They began to ask themselves, even those who supported the IRA, they said, what, my God, what have we been telling ourselves? One of the most, and I'm not going to go on, I'll end this very soon now, one of the most important interventions in the recreation of that memory in the north came from a legendary IRA man, infamous if you come from one side, heroic if you come from the other, a man called Martin Meehan, who identified that his great-uncle, Camillus Clark, had died in the service of the British Army in the great gas attacks at Hulloch in 1916. Now, here was the IRA man with all the credentials. He was a killer, a jailbreaker, a man of enormous courage, enormous ruthlessness, a terrible man. But he was brave enough to admit that the imperfections in his own Republican credentials. And that within the Republican community began an entire process of rediscovery, which parallels the discovery that took place amongst all Irish groups. What has happened in the last 20, 25 years is a testimony to the capacity for generosity in the Irish people and their capacity for imagination, which I don't think exists in any other community in Western Europe.
Thanks very much. Ruth, did that sort of struggle that Kevin has outlined in bringing World War I back into popular consciousness in Ireland, do you think that affected the way the 1916 commemorations were prepared for and thought about?
Well, I think in the end, it's what Kevin was saying, and in a way, and Kevin did a great deal to do this. People were shamed, and then Enniskillen was the moment of astonishing shame. But the work you put into it for years in trying to tell people what they'd actually done to a generation of people who had died for Ireland was of enormous importance. And I mean, we're being very personal here, but I grew up in a rather odd house, and among the oddnesses were the mad Republican granny upstairs and the granny downstairs who hated granny upstairs for very good reasons, and whose so granny downstairs was what you would call was the peasant called a Sullivan, but her husband had joined the army, not the British Army, the army in 1916, because he was a gamekeeper, and the son of the great house had been killed, and he lied about his age. He was 48. And he joined up in order to avenge him in France. Mm. Whereas upstairs, Granny, mad Republican Granny, had married an English Methodist who had become a Quaker and a pacifist, and had turned into a crazy Republican who was also a fascist. So she had a picture of Hitler at the bottom of her bed. She had been in mourning for a very long time after the death of Mussolini, whom she deeply fancied. And then Stalin, she found rather attractive in her later years. And there was a story, I wasn't witness to this, but my brother relates being hauled into Granny downstairs' bedroom on one occasion. And she said, I'm going to show you something. She said, I can't do a Cork accent, but it was in a very thick Cork accent. I'm going to show you something, she said. And she got out her late husband's medals. And she showed them all very proudly. And she said, whatever you do, don't tell her upstairs, or I'll never hear the end of it. And that was the atmosphere, because, I mean, the point was the silence. I think that's what had to be broken. The silence was astonishing. I knew my grandfather had been in the army. I knew my uncle Jack was in the British Army then. I thought I was the only child in Ireland who had relatives in the army, and that was because my parents were prone to talk about things. Most people didn't. They just hid them. And, you know, I didn't go out bragging about it. You know, you knew it was something you didn't mention. I wasn't ashamed of it, because nobody was ashamed. Well, my parents weren't ashamed. But who would you talk to about it, since nobody else had any relatives in the army? And it was this terrible silence that was shocking. And I'll give you one more personal thing. It was very important to me, because I was very alarmed about how 1916 would be commemorated. And of course, Ireland being Ireland, we got very late in the day, actually, to doing something about it and making decisions. And I was doing a lot of talks in strange places, because I brought a book out around the time of the commemoration. And I couldn't believe how sophisticated and curious audiences had become compared to the way they used to be in the past. I mean, normally because I'd written a book about Patrick Pearse that didn't appeal to Republicans, I got quite a lot of abuse at these things. This time around, people wanted to talk, and they wanted to talk about people from all traditions. And I think my seminal moment was rather nervously going to a very small village called Kilty Clogher in Leitrim. Its only claim to fame is that it is the birthplace of Sean McDermott. They are so proud of Sean McDermott. He's the only statue in the street. There's only one street, essentially. And they had a vigil for him exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, 100 years after he was executed. So I didn't think they'd be in a particularly good mood for me. And I went there, and I had a very long day. It was a very long journey, and missed things in the way and so on. And at about 9 o'clock at night, I really would have given an awful lot just to go to a pub and have a drink with somebody agreeable, but I knew nobody. And I thought I'll go back to the guest house, because I'm really rather nervous about introducing myself, because I know there's a crazy, mad cousin who doesn't like revisionists, to put it mildly. And a man came up to me and said, would you like to come to the pub? I didn't even know there was a pub, and I'd gone with anybody at this stage. I didn't ask him. So he said, on the way there, he said, I read your book, and the 7, I really liked it. And I said, oh, that's very nice. And who are you? And he said, Pádraig Pearse McDermott. So he was the great nephew. And we had a wonderful evening, and with his wife and his sister, and we were thrown out after hours, and we got on tremendously. And he followed his great uncle's career with interest, but he lived in England. He was married to a woman from the Church of England. It was his second marriage. He was detached, but he was still Irish. He recognised his great uncle's virtues, and he recognised his failings. But when I gave the talk later that day, what moved me most was a woman who got up in the very end, and she said, there's one thing I'm ashamed of in our history, she said, and that's what we did to all those men who came home after that terrible time, and we ignored them, and we reviled them, and we should be ashamed. Now, to hear that in Kilty Clogher was quite spectacular. So there was that mood. I think there had been an enormous change in public mood, and I would give a lot of credit to the Queen, because her visit in 2011, it was the respect she showed that made a big difference to our national psyche, because we have an inferiority complex, as you know, particularly about the British. And she did it so well that she had 96% of the population with her. So everybody was in the mood to be generous. I think there was part of that. And the Battle of the Somme commemorations happening in the same year was very important too, because they were beginning to recognise this. So I think the mood just happened to be right. And the politicians responded to it.
Yeah. Julia, like Ruth, I think you have a personal connection with Ireland in the First World War too, don't you? Have you brought
not so much Ireland.
Some props?
I've got some props, but not so much Ireland. So I'm only Irish by adoption as much as you'll have me. I'm German Jewish through and through. All 4 of my grandparents were born in Germany. But what is significant is that I had members of the family on both sides in the First World War, German and British. And this is my German grandfather, who was in the First World War, who was one of the very unusual German Jewish refugees who didn't throw away his Iron Cross when he got to England. And this is his passport from less than 20 years later, marked with a J for Jewish, and of course he was made to scrub the streets in his hometown. And they'd been in Heilbronn, where he came from, for 600 years at least. We don't know any further back than that. So why I'm here, because I can't talk about Ireland except by adoption. But why I'm here is to say something about complexity in all of this. I find it very hard, as somebody who's British, of German Jewish descent, to honour the memory of my grandfather who fought on the German side when the Germans, 20 years later, started killing a great number of my relatives. How do you deal with that? And I think it's the complexity and, you know, the mad granny upstairs and the various grannies. I think it's really important that we recognise that there are complexities in this, but one still has a duty to recognise and perhaps even admire, and I'm going to throw that at Nigel, but certainly to recognise that the people who went to fight in the First World War did so for a variety of reasons. We've been hearing about all that, but that whatever their motives, we ought to accord them some kind of respect. And the fact of the great silence when they came back, I think, is so horrific. And that's equally true, talking about grandparents who fought on the German side in the First World War, if you're in Britain, if you're in London. And I remember raising at my synagogue that perhaps we should record the Jews who'd fought on the German side in the First World War as loyal Germans, because that was who they were, in our Remembrance Sabbath service. And I mean, the reaction was, kind of, is the woman completely off her head? Is she completely mad? Because you can't do that, because we're British and loyal and all of that. And I just thought, I think people are not exploring the complexity. And what I've admired in Ireland over the last, I suppose, 20 years, and I think, Kevin, you are responsible for some of that, and Ruth, you too, is the beginning of accepting that people had mixed motives in serving, but they're still worthy of respect and commemoration. And the only other thing I want to say at this point is our Irish people are good at remembering and also deliberate forgetting, but you don't hold a candle to Jews. You're just not in our league. Every festival, we have a memorial service as part of the service, where we, if you like, do our personal remembering of people who perished. But we also, and it actually starts tomorrow night, and it's coincidence that it fits with the Passchendaele centenary, but we have a festival, a fast day, called the 9th of Av, the Hebrew month of Av, where we commemorate, because we have long memories, the destruction of the temple twice, once in 586 BC and once in 70 AD. And then we lump into that any other tragedies, of which there were many, as a general massive fast day. I have to say it's not something I, as a Reformed Jew, observe, but many of my more Orthodox colleagues do. But we are serious about remembering. And it's both. It's the personal and it's, if you like, the communal. The communal is the one that starts tomorrow night. But the personal, our grandparents who fought, whatever their motives, I think it's really important we reclaim that. And I think that it's important here. I was asked to officiate with some Christian clergy at Remembrance Sunday some years ago in Bandon. And I found it incredibly moving to see the old Irish soldiers from World War II marching down the hill. And that was the first time I'd ever seen it, and it was the first time they'd ever done it, actually. And it seems to me that that reclaiming and that allowing people's personal pride and personal memories is the bit about commemoration that we first have to grasp hold of, and then the second bit is how do we do it communally.
Nigel, your most recent book, of course, is called Defending War. How does commemoration fit into your thesis?
Just picking up on something that Julia said, I mean, I think these matters are morally and emotionally complex. I spend a lot of my time visiting military cemeteries. Don't ask me why, I just do. And I've often reflected on what it is I'm doing when I do that. And I think the answer is complicated. But my inner Jesuit likes to make distinctions, so I'm trying to find a way of making sense of this welter of emotion. Clearly in public commemorations, we do different things. War is controversial. We don't all agree about whether war is ever justified, be it First World War, be it Anglo-Irish, be it Civil War, and then we don't agree which side is just, right? So we're going to disagree about how to react to the commemoration of war. That said, it seems to me that we all ought to agree that lamentation is appropriate. Because even if you think one side fought justly, one can still lament the awful destructiveness of war, the casualties, the bereaved, the legacy of bitterness. So, for example, Unam mentioned the British and Commonwealth Cemetery at Suda Bay in Crete. If you drive beyond Chania to the west, you will come across, as I did for the third time last May, the German military cemetery, which lies on a hill above the airfield over which German paratroops and Cretan, Greek, British and New Zealand troops fought in May 1941 when the Germans invaded. And just before you get to the graves, there is a permanent exhibition. And one of the most striking features of the exhibition is a story told about three brothers. I think their surname is von Blücher. And what happened was that the elder brother joined up the elite German parachute regiment. The other two who hero worshipped their elder brother followed suit. All three dropped out of the skies onto Crete in May 1941. All three were killed on the same day. Now, that is a humanly tragic and poignant story. Every time I say it, tears well up. I must be getting sentimental in my old age. Deeply moving story, and I can lament the fact this ever happened. But I'm Anglo-Saxon, I'm a Brit. So I have to observe that the exhibition was silent about what young Germans were doing dropping out of the sky onto Crete, and what on earth those on the receiving end were supposed to do. Like most Brits, probably like most of you here, all things considered, I think that the war against Hitler in 1939 to 45 was morally justified, all things considered. I therefore have to infer that the killing of the von Blücher brothers was morally justified, and I do that. But I can say that at the same time as lamenting the fact that it was ever necessary. So, but there are, there's lamentation, but there's also judgment there too. They can happen at the same time. Just a point on, I want to pick up on something else Julia said about admiration, and so far I'm able to say I can sympathise with the human tragedy of two young brothers hero worshipping the elder one into a regiment, not knowing where this is all going to end up, and see where it ends up. That's just dreadful. What about admiration? Well, yes, I've read enough history about the unjust side in the Second World War to recognise there were noble people on the other side, yes. Very noble people, and people who tried their best to behave virtuously and mercifully. So virtue is not all on one side, and I think in addition to lamentation at commemorations, which we can share the lamentation, we should also share the admiration for the fortitude, the loyalty, the magnanimity that both sides would have shown, regardless of how you judge the justice of the issue. Now, I think that's all pretty uncontroversial. The controversial bit is whether ever, in public commemorations of conflict, pride and gratitude should enter in. And this is controversial because it depends on how you judge the conflict. As a Briton, when I watch the 11th of November Remembrance Day ceremonies at the Cenotaph in Westminster, among my emotions are without doubt pride and gratitude. I'm proud we did what we did. More controversially, I also think the British and Irish and Imperial War against Wilhelmine Germany in 14 to 18 was morally justified. That's much more controversial. And I'll be glad to explain why I think that later, but I'll leave that aside for the moment because we're just focusing on commemoration at the moment. But the final thing to say is, even if you identify with one side and you think that they fought justly and therefore that they sacrificed their lives for a just cause and are grateful for that, even if you think that, there is still room, probably, very probably, for shame. Because war is usually a large-scale affair. It usually lasts a long time. And whatever the just side, it will commit, through some of its members, atrocities. That's a fact of war, whatever the just side. So Although I regard the war against Hitler in 39 to 45 as a just war, all things considered, I think, as far as I can tell at the moment, that the carpet bombing of German cities, especially Dresden, was immoral because it was terroristic in intent. Okay? So when I contemplate that as a Brit, I'm ashamed. Right? So, lamentation, admiration for both sides, pride and gratitude, depending upon how you judge the matter, but also shame altogether. Not everyone will share all of those emotions. Pacifists certainly won't share any sense of pride or gratitude. But even across our political divides, I think we can share at least one or two of those.
Thanks very much, Nigel. A few more quick comments from the panel, and then we'll open it up. Kevin.
Yes, last June, we commemorated the Battle of Messines, which saw the largest and most deliberate mass murder in the history of war up until Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 10,000 Germans were killed by the explosion of 1 million pounds of high explosive under their trenches. And in the prelude to Messines, I grew increasingly concerned about the absence of the German dimension in our commemorations. If I throw, obviously many Irish served and fell at Messines, and I'll give you some of the names that the men died. Robert Glass, Private Doyle, and Private Egan. What makes those three men distinctive in this particular conversation is that they were all Germans of Irish ancestry. There was also a David Glass from Tyrone who died on the same day as Robert Glass. They had no connection, but they died in the same battle. And so too did Friedrich Schmidt. And Friedrich Schmidt's of interest to us because he died with the 14th Royal Irish Rifles. He was from Salt Lake City. He had enlisted in across the Atlantic, enlisted in the London Regiment, and in the process of reinforcement after losses, the Royal Irish Rifles made a point from 1915 onwards of never taking reinforcements from Irish regiments. They only took reinforcements from British regiments to reinforce their Britishness. So we have already entered an area of great moral complexity, with all these different strands and different identities and different memories. And who will know the names Robert Glass and Private Doyle and Private Egan? And I had to contact a German to find out these names. But I think now, after all these years, we should be able, in all decency, to say that all our dead, and the British dead who served in Irish regiments, and there were a lot of them by 1917 because our casualties had been so heavy in 1916, and as we've already agreed, there were no reinforcements coming from home, so Irish regiments were made strong by British reinforcements, and so on and so forth. It's not just a political issue, it's a moral issue. Are the German dead of Messines Ridge less entitled to our respect than the Irish dead? Do we, in their extinction, differentiate? Do we discriminate? And I don't think in all decency that it's appropriate. The days of nationalising the dead of the war are over. It doesn't make any sense to say, well, we will commemorate the dead of Messines if they wore British Army uniforms or New Zealand Army uniforms or Australian Army uniforms or Vimy Ridge, a Canadian Army, but not the Germans who fought against. And none of the men responsible who died that day were responsible for the war. We can say that truly of the Second World War. So I agree with Nigel and I agree with Julie. I think we are in a position now where we can enlarge both ceremonial and our monumental commemoration of the dead of the wars.
Julia?
Can I just add something? You mentioned some names, very specific names. And what I think we're really bad at is recording the names of people who've got no one left to remember them. And it seems to me that one of the things that one can do, and one of the things I have found very moving, and I found very moving here at the Remembrance Sunday in Bandon, was just listing the names of the people who died in both World Wars and indeed in the Boer War. Not saying anything about motive, not saying anything about the complexities of why they'd even volunteered, but just listing the names. And I think there is something about recording the names, and I think one could do that. Indeed, I think one could do that for people who died on both sides. Certainly, I would feel more comfortable with the First World War. I think I'd find that more difficult in the Second World War for fairly obvious reasons. But I think that there is something about recording the names of people who have no one left to remember them. And although sometimes I think, we're just completely obsessional about not being able to forget, and as I said before, Jews are really good at that. But I think recording names of people who have no one left to remember them is something that is important for us to do. And I think in a way it's also a healing thing. I think it helps people remember and commemorate without passing judgment.
We don't really do that in Ireland, Ruth, do we?
Well, we have.
We're not all that good at it in Britain, actually.
It's a little one-sided. I just, to go off a slight tangent, Kevin was being nice about Bertie Ahern and indeed Fianna Fáil on this. And I would also like to give honour to Enda Kenny in the way he handled the commemoration. But I also want to, because I can't be seen to be smarming up with him because he's off, Dan Mulhall, the ambassador in London, who's off to Washington, and we will miss him. Because he has a passion for history, and because he's very open to debate and so on, he had a series of events throughout the year at the embassy. From the aspects, every aspect, and we mustn't call it the British Army, but we don't mean, from every conceivable perspective, and very open conversations. And they were just terrific events. And to have a diplomat taking that kind of lead was just as important as to have a politician taking that sort of lead. So I just want to thank him on behalf of all the people who've appreciated what he did, and the way that he went around the country actually spreading knowledge in a sophisticated sort of, in a way that related to people, talking to Irish people in England from a much wider perspective than they were used to seeing. And I think that's been terrific. So thank you, Dan.
Okay, perhaps one comment from Julia and...
Can I just add to that, because it's significant in this discussion? Dan, thank you, and we will miss you, and Greta as well, we'll really miss you. But there was one particular occasion where we were present, which I was just completely blown away about, which was a concert at the Wigmore Hall, the epicenter of classical music in London, with Irish singers, amazing Irish singers, quite a lot of Irish compositions, but both national anthems and both flags flying at a concert. And I think, for most people, they were blown away. And it was the most extraordinary event. And I think it made a huge difference to how a lot of English people, and I'm using the word advisedly, how English people viewed the Irish tradition, particularly in relation to the First World War.
Poor old Brian Cooper doesn't agree with that.
What did I say?
Brian Cooper, I should tell you, when he died in 1938, he served with the 10th Irish Division in Gallipoli. And when he died in 1938, the Free State put, or the authorities, wasn't the Free State at that point, put a tricolour and a Union Jack on his coffin. And there you talk about Irish and British coming together, and that falls.
That's what I said.
It took ages to set that up, by the way. Okay, thanks very much, Julia. We'll open to the floor, but if I may, I wonder, could we just hear from Dan very, very briefly? Maybe you could step up to the microphone, Dan. He struck us all yesterday, didn't he, when he said that in the one day he had to do the Psalm in the morning and the 1916 in the evening.
Yeah.
But it'd be just lovely to hear some of your views.
Well, look, when I started off on this road last year, or the year before last, in fact, I started doing commemoration. In fact, I started commemorating when I first arrived in 2014, because I had a commemoration of the centenary of the Home Rule Act, because I felt that was important to commemorate as well. And I was determined to commemorate every aspect of Ireland's past during that, what I accept was a very complicated period, and commemorating complexity gives rise to major challenges, because, and I was particularly pleased that during my time in London, I was the first Irish ambassador ever to lay a wreath at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday, and I did that in 2014, 15, 16, and 17. So, oh, sorry, 16. Sorry, I didn't do 17.
Haven't got to 17 yet.
but anyway, so that was, and you know, when I was laying that wreath, I was quite struck by the fact that I was doing it in memory, in particular, of 35,000 Irishmen who lost their lives in that conflict. And I often said I was making no judgment whatsoever about the conflict or about the rights and wrongs of people's decisions to do service in the British Army during the war, or to stay at home and to fight for Irish independence in 1916 and after. Because one of the things I did was I wrote a piece for The Guardian about MacDonagh and Kettle, and I realised that they were, as I said yesterday, parallel lives, but their lives went in different directions and ended differently. And I think it's important for us as Irish people today to be able to recognise the complexity of our past and not to try to put it into black and white dichotomies, but to recognise that that was a fascinating period in Irish history. Hugely talented people emerged in our country. Some of them ended up, like James Joyce, as a major writer. Some of them ended up fighting in 1916 and the aftermath. And some of them ended up fighting and dying on the Western Front. And I, for one, was determined during the last 4 years in Britain to remember and to respect the memory of all of those people, because we can't, it's not up to us to make judgments on them. It's up to us to remember them and to remember the complexity of the circumstances in which they found themselves. A tragic complexity which forced people to make life and death decisions, which for many of them ended up in their lives being shortened, such as the cases I'm most familiar with of Willie Redmond, Tom Kettle, and Francis Ledwidge. But also, of course, think about the sacrifice made by Thomas MacDonagh, with a young family left behind. Eamon de Valera could easily have been executed. All those young men who went out in 1916, they also had to deal with a complex situation, and they dealt with it, and they made a life and death decision, which in their case ended up seeing them facing execution in Dublin in 1916. So I'm happy to say that, looking back on my 4 years, that I'm one thing I'm happy about is that I do believe that I paid sufficient and appropriate tribute to all of those people and the complexities of the situation in which they found themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. He has been stunning.
Thanks very much, Dan, and I echo the appreciation of all you've done for us in London and over your last 4 years. Right, Eve.
I just have a question for the panel, but for Kevin in particular. Because when I've looked through Irish newspapers from the 1920s, and you can see the commemorations of the First World War in Dublin, and there were thousands of people on them. Thousands and thousands of people. Now, I know the IRA attacked them, but it was kind of the sideline of events. And I also know that throughout Ireland at local level, you had lots of Great War veterans who organised their own commemorations, and by and large, they were able to do so without anybody challenging them or making a fuss about it. So I just wonder if we should be making a distinction between official commemoration and state commemoration of Irish participation in the Great War and commemoration.
Well, just for the purposes of the Free State, Kevin O'Higgins lost two brothers in the Great War, and he was very vocal about this. But he said that the men who died in the Great War weren't responsible for the creation of the Free State, which obviously is to a certain degree true. It's quite a complex argument, but that's the point he took as the position he held, and the Free State authorities were tolerant of this. And so largely in a passive way was De Valera. He didn't like the fact that these events were taking place, but he didn't do a great deal to prevent them. But once the IRA attacks began. And these, I think, were motivated deliberately to give him an opportunity to restrict the public displays of what seemed to be pro-Britishness. But the really important event was the Second World War, which thereafter, after this, I can see you're anxious to reply to me. But after the Second World War, any public commemoration became a sign of kind of perceived as hostility to Irish independence, and it took a different tenor after that. You're so anxious to say something.
No, because you say all these reasonable things, and then you just throw something in there, Kevin. No, because the thing is, did you say that De Valera was working with the IRA?
No, I didn't say that.
What did you say?
No, I didn't say that. The IRA...
Because the IRA were attacking those commemorations in 1924, 25.
Yeah, no, but look, the reason I talk about... I happened to be talking to a man who was in Enniskillen Fusiliers and was in the IRA. And he took part in the attacks in 1931, and he told me that the attacks, or 32, the attacks really became much more serious while Fianna Fáil were in power, because the IRA felt, and having been he was from Ardoyne, Enniskillen Fusiliers in the First World War. Then he joined the IRA, and then he said that they realised that with Fianna Fáil in power, there was more likelihood to create the political circumstances in which public displays of what was seen to be pro-Britishness could be restricted. And that's the point I was making. Now, merely because it doesn't appear in the history books doesn't mean it didn't happen.
No, I agree.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Sorry, can we have this question here first, and then... There's a queue, you see.
It didn't go to the rest of the panel, though.
It's fine.
Yeah.
I think it's a couple of observations, if I may, or an observation and a half question. The first, this meeting of minds, if you like, in Britain and Ireland about the challenges of tackling commemoration is of extraordinary relevance in many parts of the world that are learning from it.
Absolutely.
India, in particular, is facing a very considerable dilemma about how it remembers the extraordinary losses of the Indian Army in the Second World War and its campaign against the Japanese. And that is a very, very live intellectual debate, and this supports that. It will be very significant at some point in the Balkans as the former Yugoslavia in its various parts comes to terms with what happened in the 1990s. But I think for those conflicts which are further back, such as the First World War that you're discussing, there is a meeting of minds clearly about the need to commemorate and the need to commemorate fairly. The challenge is in many ways trying to find a way that commemorates that actually captures people's attention. Not so much the sort of people who are sitting in this room, but the people who are, loosely if I can generalise, perhaps I'll just talk about myself, a generation younger or 2 generations younger. And one of the things that I would point to was the way in which 1418 now, last year, those of you who were in Britain on the 1st of July will recall the sudden emergence into public places of groups of individuals dressed in First World War army uniforms who did not speak to any passers-by, but when anybody approached them would simply hold out a card which said, "My name is such and such. I was killed at 7:02 on the 1st of July in the Battle of the Somme." And that had the most extraordinarily profound effect upon a generation that sort of respects commemoration but doesn't quite understand what it is that's important. And it's going to be things like that, finding actually very new ways of commemorating, which are not, if you like, the staples of cenotaph memorials and Phoenix Park and so forth, which will make commemoration an active social engagement in the way it needs to be.
Who would like to comment on that?
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
I think you're completely right, by the way, that, and I know a bit about what's been going on in India, and they really haven't worked out a way of commemorating. And we do need new ways of commemorating. And oddly enough, the Germans have invented a way of commemorating particularly sort of Jewish families. They've got these stumbling blocks of where Jews used to live. And the handing out of cards I thought was completely brilliant. I'm with you on that. But we've got to be much more creative than that. And it will be, I think, stuff in schools, and it will be possibly actually just stuff with using digital media, Facebook, just recording individuals and saying a little bit about their histories. But we're going to have to involve people in very, very different ways, because I don't think, however
moving the cenotaph might be, however moving a Remembrance Sunday observance might be here, and I have found them very moving here, that's not going to attract people who are at the moment are, say, under 25.
Judy, the poppies.
Yes, say something about the poppies.
Well, just the poppies at the tower.
Yeah,
How many were there?
Oh, I mean, it was
everybody who died.
Everybody who died. So there was a red sort of ceramic poppy for everyone who died. But the thing that was completely extraordinary, because I went to see it, at first I was rather put off by the idea, but when I went to see it, and it is extraordinary to be with huge numbers of people in silence. And so being there, with everybody there being silent and sort of shuffling past, was astonishing, and that grasped the public imagination. And then when they sold them off afterwards, they ran out. I mean, they just couldn't satisfy the demand. And nobody's quite sure, but it looks as if a lot of people who actually bought them were younger. So that was one way. And actually, young people do wear poppies in Britain. They do.
Interesting. We've got 5 minutes, so I'll... Yunan.
In terms of saying the Second World War ended any acknowledgement of Irish participation in the First World War, whatever, because I don't think it did. I think Eve was right. There's a difference between the state and the official and the informal. And the informal continued, and it dies out to a large extent because the generation die out. The widows, who are very important, in a sense, die, and there's a natural dropping away. And I have to say also, anyone who's studied the history of Irish republicanism, particularly in relation to pensions, there's no cohort in Ireland more certain that Ireland doesn't realise what they gave for their country than people who were in the IRA or who have claimed to be in the IRA. Veterans are like that. They feel nobody else understands. It's not particular, it seems to me, to Irish men and women who served in British forces. It's a generic pathology amongst veterans, and we should. That's why we should do comparative history rather than focusing, which is why India is very important.
I'm sorry to tell you that I agree with every word you just said. It's one of the things that has really baffled me is the failure of the people of the Republican tradition to do what you're doing, to assemble a list of the Republican dead from 1916 to 1923, or thereafter. And it is baffling, and yet all veterans feel unappreciated, and this is true in both communities in Ireland. But in the 1950s, the Island Bridge remained a part, and 60s was a private thing for the British Legion. It was but minded by the Office of Public Works. In 1970, somebody withdrew. Somebody made a decision to withdraw the gardeners. That was an active decision, and it paralleled and it wasn't obviously not. It's a parallel. It's not. There's no connectivity, but it paralleled the beginning of the IRA bombing campaign. It's a very complex issue, as we keep on using this word complex, and it's complex here. Okay, but I have agreed with you. Remember that and cherish that.
All right. We have time. Okay, 2 more questions, I'm afraid. This gentleman here, he had his hand up first.
Nigel's very quiet.
And then
There's a woman there.
and a woman over there, right? You'll have the last word.
Yeah.
Okay.
My actually interest would be actually from the naval point of view, the Royal Navy and that, you know. And I suppose the first thing, about commemoration and of sailors. The difficulty is that, say, if a soldier dies in the trenches, his mate can take letters or photographs or whatever and get something back to the family. There's often a grave, at least you know where they died. The sailor had everything on board his ship, all his personal belongings. They disappeared, and so there were very few mementos came back to the family. So I think the sailor was forgotten much sooner than the soldier afterwards, because once the parents went, the siblings went, he was faceless, I suppose, really, and was forgotten. And I have done a lot of study on the Battle of Jutland in particular, and here in West Cork, in Cork County, there was 120 sailors died in the Battle of Jutland, which was, I suppose, the greatest sea battle ever fought, and had huge significance. And the way the sea battle or sea war continued afterwards with the unrestricted submarine warfare, which had implications for merchant seamen. And when you compare 120 Corkmen died, there was only 104 in the whole province of Ulster actually died in the Battle of Jutland. But what I found when I was researching, there's very, very little written about the Cork experience or even the Irish sailors' experience in the First World War. And I think we have forgotten, the sailors really have been kind of forgotten compared to the soldiers. Sorry, just one more point. I think it's an excellent idea at these commemorations where you have a roll of honour and you call out the names. It suddenly means something. There's something there that you can focus on. And I've seen that with, kind of where there's commemorations for lost sailor or lost fishermen and stuff like that, people that are lost at sea. When you call out a name, there's something to link onto.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have actually written about this, and you're right, that the Royal Navy has been forgotten. The first Irish dead of the Great War were not soldiers at Mons. They were sailors on HMS Amphion that was hit by a mine in the North Sea. There were 120 sailors there, 20 of them were Irish, and the first one that I use as a token of all the others is Pierce Murphy from Thorncastle Place in Ringsend. And just as a matter of coincidence, Thorncastle Place was the size of this marquee. In the first bayonet charge at Mons in late August the first British bayonet charge of the war, led by the Royal Irish Regiment, led by John Dennis Shine from Waterford. One of the people who was killed was Stephen Corrie, who was the grandson of an Italian choir master in the Pro Cathedral. And he too was from Thorncastle Place. So in the act of commemoration, there has also been the act of non-commemoration. Here, this one tenement gave the first soldier to die in the Great War, just about, and the first seaman to die in the Great War. It's emblematic of all the 35 or 40,000 Irishmen who had to die, indeed of the 750,000 imperial soldiers who were to die, and yet there is no commemorative plaque to honour the memory of these men who stand for so many in the years to follow.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And final question. You wanted a question, did you? Somebody? Yeah.
Thank you. Given that you're all great and experienced historians, expert in the past in various dimensions, how do you feel the present vitriolic nationalism, populism that we're seeing breaking out, with particular reference to the UK or to America, how do you think that might be addressed through, for example, commemoration? I mean, I'd just be interested to hear how you think about that, because it's like the elephant in the room.
Maybe quick answers from everyone. Nigel?
I suppose I have to say I don't agree with your premise. I don't see a vitriolic nationalism. I think the Brexit vote is much more complicated than that. So off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure how commemoration would address that, except in ways that's already been mentioned, in terms of recognise that when we commemorate, we don't just commemorate our own people. We need to commemorate the noble on the other side and the damn tragedy of it all, and may it not happen again.
Kevin?
Yeah, I agree with Nigel. I'm afraid I don't agree with the premise. I don't necessarily identify vitriolic nationalism as the sole cause of the events in America and in the United Kingdom. Lots of forces are at work. That's not necessarily vitriol. Vitriol is quite a powerful chemical, and yeah, it's just one of these are times of great stress for everyone in the United Kingdom, for Europe, for Ireland. The times of unparalleled stress in my lifetime. We are so many uncertainties and so many unknowns, and we do not know the outcome of what's going on, which is really strange. And I'm not sure that the role of commemoration has provide any balm to this. I do understand why you asked the question. The question is valid. But in this confusion, I can't answer.
Okay, thanks very much. Julia?
I can't answer it either, but I do think it's worth saying that, and I'm ashamed and embarrassed by the Brexit vote, and I'm trying to get myself a German passport. But I think it is worth saying that in Britain, there's quite a lot of evidence to say that those in favour of Brexit were the old rather than the young, and the rural more than the urban. But the significance of the old rather than the young is that they have historically been more interested in commemoration. And I just think that there may be something that we need to address in, and I'm not sure I'd sort of describe it as vitriolic, but I think there may be something we need to address in an age divide where, if you like, wanting to be on your own is also linked to people who are taking a particular kind of national pride in what took place over world wars or whatever. And I think that that's going to need some quite complex, we use that word a lot, I think that's going to need some quite sensitive addressing.
Thank you very much. And Ruth will have the last word on this matter.
Vitriolic nationalism is what we were hearing in the last couple of days from a couple of people who you may remember were ranting the same old Irish Republican, unforgiving, narrow refrain. That's vitriolic. The Sinn Féin excesses in that regard in Northern Ireland are vitriolic. To mention Nigel Farage in the same breath is ludicrous. I've lived in England since I was 21, and it is astonishingly free of nationalism, and I voted for Brexit. I know it may be because I'm old, but it's not because I'm fat and stupid and underemployed. It's because I gave it a great deal of thought, as did a lot of my friends, and in the end we concluded that the fit just didn't work with the United Kingdom, with the EU, and we also thought the EU was probably finished.
Thank you very much indeed. You may approach Ruth one by one.
I agree with Ruth, you see. I would have voted Brexit.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank the panel hugely for that really entertaining discussion, and if you could all show your appreciation too.
Given the commemorations